Hi, I'm cold, so I'm covered in many blankets. I have a hood even. Ooh. um, Today we're gonna read that sequel essay from Flowerbomb called Destroy Race, Destroy Society, Another Diary of Mayhem and Race Nihilism. This was published 2022. I don't know if I'm gonna finish it. It's like 10 print pages long. We'll get at least halfway through it. I dedicate this writing to my childhood homies, Jose and Carlos N., Marcus B., Mark and Sam D., Barry M., and Eric N. R.I.P. to those who caught an early grave. I got nostalgic as fuck writing this. In 2017, I wrote a text called Really Though, Not All Black People Give a Fuck About White Dreads. It was the first text I wrote under the name Flowerbomb, a moniker for an animal of both gentle love and armed fury. I'd written that text with no purpose other than to vent and lash out at identity politicians and their internet lynch mob allies. So I decided to write an extended version of that text to include my personal history and experiences, which led to my critique of race. Everyone has a story, a unique personal history that shapes their individuality. Some stories are glorified by society, and some are buried beneath an anvil of disapproval and censorship. This is my story, however unpopular of a perspective it may be. Word on the street was that the city put a call out to residents to come help push a large casino boat into the river. Even though it was only about 2 blocks from the street I lived on, I wasn't interested because I already had resentful feelings towards this project. Long before the casino was built, there was low-income housing along the river. Eventually, these old buildings went to shit, became abandoned, and were demolished. All those open lots in the immediate area became available for street vendors and summer pop-up carnivals. As kids, we would spend all day in the carnival trying to steal shit from vendors who tried to overcharge for petty trinkets. Sometimes we all just sat on the edge of the river eating flamin' hot Cheetos. We didn't have much, and neither did the area, but we made the best of it. After a few years, the city started upcharging vendors to use the lots, and a little later after that, even the pop-up carnival stopped coming. That's about the time we saw the construction trucks start moving in. After a mass of residents helped push the boat into the water, the casino opened its doors October 6, 1994. This casino was attached to a pavilion that included an all-you-could-eat buffet and a movie theater. Not gonna lie, that was one thing many of us kids were excited about. But it didn't take long for me to understand what the city had done and further planned to do. I soon discovered a hidden truth behind all the bright lights and excitement. I realized that for every out-of-town rich guy who walked in there were about 3 broke-ass parents from the hood walking in as well. Understandably, people from my hood saw the casino as a place for employment, as well as a place to hit it big. Imagine a casino selling alcohol the same way it advertises itself as a beacon of hope and riches, setting up in an area already dominated by intoxication and poverty. We all knew the local pawn shops and liquor stores capitalized on the frequent breaking and entering incidents and armed robberies in the hood, but the casino came along and showed us the after effects of alcoholism and gambling addiction combined. In my teens, I watched my hood rapidly descend into a new level of poverty as gangs became more violent in competition for control over territory and drug distribution. The death toll in the area increased. The casino continued to expand its operation, and subsequently, the number of gambling addicts increased, along with an increased desperation for lost rent money. Muggings near the immediate area of the casino became a regular occurrence. Soon, nobody knew who was really mugged and who was simply using the police report of a mugging as a cover for gambling away rent money. As more people lost their homes to gambling debt and struggles with addiction, I noticed more white people coming in and buying up property. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a few white people already in my hood. They were just as broke as the rest of us. The new white people I started seeing drove through with brand new cars, happy-looking families, and I remember first assuming they were lost. The only other white people we ever really saw who looked out of place were the Jehovah's Witnesses. Over time, my mom and I were pushed from apartment to apartment as property value increased. Every kid I grew up with that survived and wasn't locked up ended up moving somewhere miles away. Today, luxury condos now line the river next to the casino in the exact same place all those vendors would set up along the yearly pop-up carnival. From the capitalist perspective, it's all a success story. For me growing up, it was a first-hand lesson on capitalism and how race and class contribute to its overall functioning. But real quick, before I go any further, I should bring up a deeper history of this area to light. I had a similar experience when I was younger, living in Dorchester, watching that area rapidly gentrify, and then the rent increasing, and then me having to leave. The passing of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 served as a declaration of eternal war on all Indigenous people. 2 years later, during the Black Hawk Indian War, 6 different Indigenous tribes, Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, and the Oshethi-Sakuig, I'm sorry if I fucked up any of those pronunciations, living in the same general area I was raised in, were slaughtered and the remainder permanently displaced. The same river we sat on the edge of as kids was used by militiamen to carry out this genocidal attack. In 1835, 2 brothers from New York established a city directly over burial mounds and whatever was left of the indigenous people's homes. In 1862, the first Black people, known as contrabands, arrived in this new city by train in 2 boxcars. They were called contrabands because they had escaped slave owners in the Confederate States and either enlisted in the army to fight in the Civil War or found work elsewhere. A large number of these individuals had been slaves on the Newsom, Oats, and Pride plantations located near Cherokee, Franklin County, Alabama. Due to unexpected hostility from the majority of local residents, including self-proclaimed slavery abolitionists, these newly freed Black folks were forced to live in a 3-block area, which was known as the settlement. This specific location was a couple blocks from the street I grew up on. The housing consisted of rugged shacks next to a small swamp that was used by the rest of the city as a dump. Over the years, police frequently brutalized people in this area, in addition to all the shit done by the newly established KKK, who tarred and feathered people there as well. Black people were forced to remain confined within the miserable conditions of the settlement for over 80 years. Whenever there was an attempt to move from this place, the KKK would make their presence known by protesting the sale of any homes to Black people. Over time, the rumored connection between the local police and the KKK became public when Klan members attended an officer's funeral. This is that specific scenario of the KKK and the police being basically the same group. And then anytime any Black person would be like, finally, I got some fucking money, would try to buy a house to like get out of shit-ass living conditions, a mob would just show up like day one and be like, you're either gonna die, you're gonna live. Or like, you're either gonna die, you're gonna leave, or you're just gonna die. Not even a fucking choice. Fast forward, like, I think that happened, I think the most recent time I remember reading about that happening was like 1980s. And like versions of that continue to happen today. And I'm sure somewhere in the last 20 years, at least 3 people have just gotten fucking murdered for moving into a white area. Fast forward to the year 1967, even though there was slight improvement in housing, the conditions were still cramped and substandard. 2 uprisings took place during that summer within the settlement. The cover picture on this scene is of the intersection where all this began. I got this off the Anarchist Library. There was not a picture attached, unfortunately. Tension between police and the people living there had been building for years. The first uprising occurred on the night of July 29th, when Black youth began throwing rocks at a police car. At the same time, gasoline was poured on the street and ignited. Soon, a crowd of more than 100 Black youth gathered and threw bricks and other objects at additional police cars that arrived on the scene. When the street was eventually cleared and after physical confrontation with police, Many of the rebels broke up into smaller groups and headed downtown towards the city hall armed with Molotov cocktails. The black youth took the streets again on the night of August 4th, throwing firebombs and causing about $150,000 in damage. Police from nearby cities had to be called in for backup. Those who were arrested were said to have been beaten bloody in holding cells and squad cars by the police. In response to this, those who were still in the streets fought with police viciously into the early morning of August 5th. The rebellion was eventually repressed and brought under police control. The local NAACP denounced the uprising as a means of achieving social change and also refuted charges of police brutality in the arrest and booking of the rebels. But unlike the common assumptions made about riots today, the firebombings and street rebellion were acknowledged by many back then as not the work of outside agitators nor the opportunistic misguidance of young delinquents, but rather the accumulated anger and frustration stemming from years of poverty and racial abuse. No one in power is afraid of a peaceful march. No one holding capital or no cop is really afraid of a nonviolent protest because it inconveniences no one. With all that said, I remember the day I got a phone call from the casino. They reviewed my job application and asked me to come in for an interview. A couple weeks later, I was making the most money I had ever made. My job title was porter, which basically meant cleaning toilets, bathrooms, cleaning ashtrays, and other maintenance-related shit. But the longer I worked there, the more I felt overwhelmed by internal conflict. I was making bank, but I was working for a place that economically devastated the area I lived in. I once went to go get supplies from the storage room, which oddly enough was located at the center of the parking garage. While walking past a few cars, I noticed one with what looked like almost 3 inches of dust on it. After asking around, I was informed that the car belonged to a man who, as a result of a severe gambling addiction, lost his house and everything he owned, and began residing in the casino as a wanderer, searching the floor for loose change. When the casino closed for 2 hours so us porters could vacuum the floor, this guy just moved over to the pavilion until it opened back up. He and his car never left. After eventually losing that job, I revisited some thoughts I had about the casino, capitalism, and race. I started down memory lane to compare what I experienced growing up to what I had come to learn over time. I never fucked with slang and dope or participating in intoxication culture as a teen, mostly because I saw the devastating effects it had on the area I lived in, as well as the effect it had on those closest to me. So rather than profiting from other people's addiction, I chose retail theft among a few other things. And while it's not necessary to mention the specific gangs I was loosely affiliated with throughout my teens, I will say I learned a few things from those experiences. Most of the gangs in my hood started in middle school with the intention of providing protection from older, more established gangs, mostly just groups of friends who looked out for each other. But as the number of members grew, so did the realization that numbers meant power, and with that power came the ability to make money through extortion, robberies, or selling dope. But since most people in the hood had very little to steal from in the first place, more people stuck with profiting from addiction. And so some of my friends were dealers and a few others developed addictions. Some people stayed solo and became stick-up kids, but as more gangs developed and competed for territory, more people carried guns. So sticking up drug dealers became harder than just forming a gang and getting in on the competition. The conditions for this type of environment aren't essential to having a casino right next door. Any impoverished area where people are desperate to survive will have these conditions. And this is the type of desperation that comes from years of internalized powerlessness as a direct result of racism, sexism, and poverty. My neighborhood had these elements long before the casino, but I could see how the casino contributed to an escalation of these elements. As people lost their money to gambling, in addition to gentrification already affecting the area, people simply became more desperate and backed into a corner. Understandably, this kind of poverty-based desperation opens the door to more violent, opportunistic ways of making money. Around 1997, landlords began selling their apartment buildings to outside investors faster than tenants could find new homes. The desperation to afford rising rent continued to fuel gang wars and social tension. After a few years of this, people from my childhood started disappearing from my life, either lost to gang-related deaths, locked up doing time, or having moved away. Because people were displaced so quickly, there was little to no time to exchange numbers. Staying in touch became more difficult as everyone was forced to move further and further away from the gentrified areas. As I was reflecting on all this, I paused for a moment, realized how nostalgic I had become. This was interesting to me because I didn't know one could have nostalgia for such miserable conditions. I started hearing the music that was popular at that time. I've encountered people who seem to have difficulty understanding the fact that, while much of the music we listened to was not politically correct and considered repulsive by social justice standards, it was a validating reflection of the environment we lived in. Even today, as I write out this text, I recognize that just the familiarity alone is enough to draw me into music from my past. When I listen to the music I listened to back then, of course there are things I hear that are cringy as fuck, but I also hear and relate to the emotions expressed by people directly impacted by their own miserable surroundings. And while I reject the myriad of oppressive views expressed in music I listen to, I can't help but continue to feel subdued by a sense of comfort and nostalgia associated with it. I believe this is because despite all the violence, memorable personal bonds can still be made in these environments. Sometimes listening to music from a past period of time refreshes the memory of those bonds and the people involved. I continued reflecting and thinking about the relationship between class and race. In all of my experience from childhood to late teens, I had seen how capitalism uses race as a tool of division to separate a marginalized group of people from a perceived superior group of people. I could see how capitalism uses race to methodologically discourage personal bonds between people of different races and people within the same race. I felt that this was done meticulously by conditioning individuals to view complex living beings as mere resources to exploit or obstacles to overcome in order to survive. When my friends would talk about being rich, I would respond by pointing out how money has a deadening effect on all facets of life. I thought about how capitalism complicates racial unity with class divisions, and as insult to injury, racial stereotypes end up being created based on the most extreme responses to poverty. I could see how this made it easier for people to become fearful of one another after associating a particular race with a plethora of crimes or behavior, rather than viewing the complex, impoverished conditions that trigger those responses in the first place. Today, while writing this, I can add on to that. I have come to understand that when a large portion of society is positioned against any particular group of people, there'll be a bonding within that marginalized group. But only to a degree. In accordance with the binary worldview of identity politics, the assumption of a superior race necessitates an opposing inferior one. Same thing with an upper class necessitating an opposing lower class of people. So understandably, one will assume the lower class and marginalized race will bond. And for years, leftists have been tirelessly working to encourage this bond in the name of a unified revolutionary uprising. But if the depth of this bond is as shallow as racial and class-based social constructs, there is still quite a bit of room for a variety of conflicting opinions and personal choices, including those that are fundamentally opposed to any anti-authoritarian project. Me when I meet trans Marxist-Leninists. Despite sharing the common class experience of being broke as fuck, people I knew in and out of the gangs had very different ideas, solutions, and responses to it. As a result, everyone grew up building different relationships to power, control, and authority. For example, while many hated the police, only a few preferred a world without police. And while many hated poverty, even fewer called capitalism into question. And the explanation for this wasn't as simple as people just not having access to anti-capitalist information. While it is the least favorable topic to discuss, probably because it challenges the leftist unified front narrative, it's not a new phenomenon. Social tension related to conflicting interests has always existed between groups and individuals in the hood. Historically, Black revolutionary groups like the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army encountered this tension with gangs and drug dealers frequently, sometimes leading to armed violence. Personally, I didn't encounter any radical or even liberal information until many years after I had already started questioning things. Ever since I was a kid, I have had an obsession with trying to understand the world around me. For example, if I wasn't curiously following stray cats around, I was venturing a few miles out of the hood alone into the small forest preserves and wooded areas. There I could climb trees and enjoy the breeze up top without having to deal with childhood bullies or police hassling me. I was also obsessed with trying to understand the complex horror I was growing up in. The first two important things I learned as a kid were not all killer cops were white, and the enemy of my enemy was not always my friend. Almost every Black and brown friend I grew up with took up positions of violent, authoritarian power, internalizing the stereotype of the prosperous white entrepreneur. Drug-dealing POC would roll by in luxury cars, flashy clothes, and taunt the rest of us the same way other classes once ridiculed them. Friendships were devastated by drug addictions and money issues. During my memory lane reflection, I had taken mental note of how most gangs glorified something similar to a colonial mindset, which included government, territorial control, and domination. For example, when gangs or crews were formed to facilitate drug dealing, they would take up territory, leading to bloody wars with rivals. Whoever was left standing would establish power and control through violence and intimidation of everyone living in the area. Anyone who threatened the manufacturing and distribution of drugs in that area was subject to vicious consequences. It seems to me that capitalism doesn't see race only when it comes to its reproduction. When I say reproduction, I mean, for example, proliferating the idea that money is more valuable than life, and that life without money is no life at all. By this logic, people of any assigned race will use any means necessary to compete with one another for capital in the name of survival. And since addiction is one of the most reliable forms of long-term profitability, the drug game tends to be the hustle of choice. And since the greater colonized America operates within the identity politics of white supremacy, people of color often live in impoverished areas where adopting this ruthless mindset becomes a viable option for survival. In addition to this conditioned mindset, society constructs racial identity with physical elements as well. Those with dark complexion are subject to any and all negative stereotypes associated with racial identity. Quite frequently, when approaching someone outside with a question, I'm immediately met with hesitation and unease. Basic social interaction was, and continues to be, complicated by the fear that I possess ulterior motives when being polite. My mannerisms and behavior will never reform the external perception of myself due to the colorism associated with race. Despite having a white mom, I am still too dark to escape Black and oftentimes brown identity labeling. So what options does identity provide for someone like myself? I could obey the law, get a job, and become a hard worker to show society that my identity is nothing to fear. Or I could sell drugs and survive on exploiting the addiction of others, further perpetuating a well-known and circulated racial stereotype. I'm gonna stop there because my voice feels tired. Probably all the fucking vaping I'm doing. It also doesn't have another line break. So, all right, that's where I'm gonna call it. I'll finish reading it tomorrow. Stay warm. That's probably very easy for everyone right now. I am just perpetually cold because I'm made of skin and bones. And all my fat is tiny. All right, peace.